A couple of classes in the .NET framework that support reading and writing data to a disk file is the XML Writer class and the XML Reader classes. And these work with XML files on disk to read and write XML and store it as a particular file. And each of those objects has a create method that takes as a parameter the full path and name of the XML file that you want to create or read. A little bit of a misnomer because you're not necessarily creating the file, you're creating a handle to the file in certain circumstances. But then other times you're actually creating the file. So don't be too worried about the names of the methods. Now the customer class that I'm using here also provides the ability to store customer information on disk and to retrieve it later. Customers aren't a transitory item. When writing a business application, you would store customers in a database, along with products, orders, employees, whatever. You would typically use entity framework code inside the methods to retrieve and modify customer records. But database applications are a bit beyond the scope of this course, and particularly this part of it. I didn't want to get bogged down in the database code, so I'm using the much simpler XML objects in order to persist the data, which is a perfectly legitimate way to persist data from classes. Okay. So again, I'm going to be using local XML files. So here's a method of the customer class called saveCustomer. The method takes as a parameter that all of the information that it's going to save, customer ID, customer name, city, and so forth. And then the method is going to return 1 if it successfully saved the customer, and it returns -1 if it doesn't. Okay, so the way it works is some calling code calls this method. It instantiates an XML writer settings. This is a way to customize how the XML is going to be written out. So I new up that object. I want to make the XML data human readable. So I'm going to specify that I want indentations for each line, and it's going to be a hierarchy. So nested elements are going to be indented further than elements higher in the hierarchy. And then the new line characters are going to be a carriage return line feed. Next, the code instantiates or gets a reference to an XML writer object. So this is the object that the code's going to actually use in order to create the file, in this case, and write out the XML to it. Now what's interesting about XML Writer is that it uses the create method as a factory method. I'm not directly newing up an object as I have so many times like I do here, but instead I'm using a static method of XML Writer, and I'm passing in a string with the location and name of the file. And so in this case, I'm going to put it in C, learn now. It's going to have the name of the customer ID that I've passed into the method. And then, as part of that creation, I'm going to pass in that settings object so that it knows the format that I want the XML to be in. All right, and then the rest of the code here is dealing with writing out XML. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on XML. Hopefully you're familiar with it. It's a fairly well-entrenched data structure. But the write start document is an instance method of that XML writer object, and it's going to write out the header, the XML header for the file. And then I'm going to use methods like write start element to begin writing a customer element, write element string, the customer ID, element string, customer name. So these are all going to be child elements of this customer element, and goes through and writes out all of that information. And as you can see, the name of the elements are pretty close to, other than casing, the names of the parameters. That's not a requirement. You can name the elements anything you want, but it's nice to be able to recognize what kind of data is being stored there. All right, and then once it writes out that element, in this case the XML is very simple. It's basically one top-level element with several child elements, called the write end element. That takes care of emitting the closing XML tags, write end of the document, and then closing this object. And so this method call takes care of calling the finalize and dispose methods of the class, which then closes out the file handle, and we now have a disk file that contains the customer information. And then I use the file object here to check to make sure that that file exists. And if it does, I return 1 from the method. So save customer will return a 1. Notice that I have return type of int. Otherwise, if there was some sort of problem, not enough disk space, disk hardware failure, whatever problem might be, it doesn't find the file at the expected location, then it returns a -1. Okay, so if I go back over here to program, here's some code that exercises that method. So I'm creating a new customer. I'm using the constructor that passes in, or I pass in all of the parameter information. So this object is going to be fully hydrated as soon as it's created. And then I'm going to call the save customer method here and pass in those parameters. So I'm just reading the values from customer. Now, as a side note, this is a method on an instance of customer. This customer object has all that information. So it's possible that I could just call save customer and not pass in that information. Okay, but that's a separate way of doing things. And then it's checking to see if save customer returned a value greater than 0. Remember that if it finds that file, it's going to return 1. That's greater than 0. Then it's going to output the line that says customer info was saved. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and execute that. Press J for save a customer. And I have 2 customers that I'm saving. I haven't talked about the second one yet. Just talking about the first one so far. All right, so now I'm going to go over here to Windows Explorer, to the Learn Now folder. And as you can see, I have Biggie and Learn Now XML files. So this is the one that was created by the code that I just reviewed with you. So you can see the root element customer, the header of the XML file, customer ID, customer name, so forth. So it's really nice that Internet Explorer has support for displaying XML data so nicely. If it's complex data, I can expand it and contract it. This is very simple. This is really just one level of nested elements. But it's really handy for displaying this information. All right, so there you can see the resulting XML file that was created by that code. Okay, so this class does what I intended it to do, but we can improve upon it. And so I kind of referenced this a moment ago. Keep in mind that a class encapsulates its data and its members, both properties and methods. Because the save customer method is a member of the customer class, and so too are all of the properties that I passed explicitly to this instance of save customer. So I really don't need to write save customer this way because the class already has all of that information embedded within it. I included it here when I instantiated the object. So instead, save customer can reference itself, its own object, and read the properties. So if I go back over to customer, I can see that I have a second instance of this. Save customer, it's overloaded, doesn't take any parameters, so the compiler is able to tell which version of save customer that I want to execute. And then pretty much all of the code is the same, with the exception that rather than getting the data from parameters, I'm just reading it directly from the current instance of the class. And in this case, I'm making it very clear using the this keyword and referencing the different properties of this customer object. All right, and it's important to understand that this is referencing the instance of the object in which this code is executing. All right, so this is used fairly frequently. Strictly speaking, it's not necessary here, but I wanted to include it in order to make it very clear what was going on. All right, and so that's the second part of the save customer method. So I'm newing up another customer using the same constructor, passing in different information. And now I have a much cleaner call to save customer. All I need to do is call that instance method on an instance of the object. Again, check to make sure that I'm retrieving or receiving back a value that's greater than 0, specifically 1 if I wanted to explicitly check for 1, and then display that the customer information was saved. And so that's why I got 2 messages that the customer information was saved. And I can come back over here, and that's now the Learn Now instance of the customer. And we have all the same information, but now it's using the data from that second customer object, and it used the much cleaner version of the save customer method. Okay, so at this point, we've saved the customer data to an XML file. It would also be handy to be able to retrieve the data as well. And for that, we implement this get customer info. And as you can see, we have a couple instances of this. So the first one I want to talk about is the version that just takes the customer ID. And then what this code does is it retrieves and reads the XML file for that customer. So this time I'm going to use an XML reader object, again use the create factory method, and this is where the name of that method can be a little bit misleading. It's a factory method, so it's creating an instance of the XML reader object. It's not creating an XML file, so that's why they named it create. Okay, so just be aware of that kind of funkiness. And now all I have to do is pass in the fully qualified file name. So I'm again passing in customer ID, inserting it into the string there. So it's going to open up c:/learnnow/biggie or learnnow, whichever file I'm going to retrieve, .xml. And then once I have that open in XML Reader, I can use a while loop in order to read all of the data. So I'm going to start by reading the customer element, getting essentially a handle to that element within the file, and then using the read to following. There's a whole bunch of different read methods, and this just happened to be the most convenient. It just goes in and reads to that element, in this case the customer ID, and then it reads the inner XML, the contents of customer ID, and assigns it to this object's customer ID. So this is actually changing the properties of the current instance of the customer. All right, so it does it for all of the interesting properties that we want, and then we're done. Now, I was a little bit sloppy. I didn't close the XML reader. I could have created it within a using statement. Well, not with the factory method there, but I really should have closed it there as well. Okay, so I can come back over here to Program, and here's some code that exercises that. So in this case, I'm using the default constructor, the empty constructor actually, in order to create an empty instance of the customer object. And then I'm using that get customer info to read the data for Biggie. So that's that file that I had previously saved, the XML file. So once this statement executes successfully, then some customer is going to contain all of the data from the Biggie file. And again, that's this file here that I created earlier. So I'll go ahead and execute the code. And I'll press K for retrieve a customer. And there you can see that it successfully retrieved the information. So I have a customer object. It's hydrated the object with the data from that XML file. And then I'm displaying various pieces of information just to demonstrate that we did in fact get the information from that XML file. Cool. Now, there's another way of doing this. You can also use arguments passed by reference to retrieve customer information. You can also use arguments passed by reference to retrieve a customer's information. And that's what the getLocation method does. So let me navigate to that. So here's an example of that kind of class method. So this method takes as a parameter the customer ID value. So that's being passed in. It's a required parameter. And then it also receives references passed, or values passed by reference, that then this method can populate. Okay, so I'm going to get the customer ID. That lets it identify which file I want. And then it can read that data using similar XML methods here in order to populate the values of these parameters passed by reference. And then because they're passed by reference, the calling code can access them. Okay, so once again, use the XML reader, the factory create method to get a specific file, passing in the customer ID as the name of the XML file. And then it, in a while loop, it reads the customer element, then the customer name, city, region, postal code, and country, and each time using the read inner XML method in order to get the contents of each of those elements. And this time what it's doing with those values is it's writing it to the parameters that were passed in by value. So as soon as this statement executes, that makes the company name available to the calling code. Okay, then I have code over here that exercises that technique. So here I have customer sum customer. I'm newing it up and using, again, the empty constructor. And then I'm creating these different strings in order to, these are the values, these variables, string variables actually, that are going to be populated with the information that I'm going to read from that XML file using the getLocation method. All right, so here's the invocation of the method. I'm passing in the customer ID that I want, and then passing by reference those different variables. The other thing, oh, and I forgot to point this out, that the getLocation method returns a string, and that passes the company name back. So nothing magical about doing this way. I could have passed that as a by reference parameter as well and returned the company name that way. But I wanted to demonstrate that you still have a return value, you only have one, and you can break it up in how you return data from a method. Okay, so that's why customer name is not initialized, doesn't need to be, because this is setting the value there. And then once again, I display that information. So now when I execute this code again, and now select L, I get the same information back. But I'm using an entirely different technique in order to get that data. I'm passing the parameters by reference and populating them that way.